Late one October evening, as a biting wind tore through the skeletal trees, Sarah stumbled across a peculiar ad while scrolling online. Seeking volunteers for a sleep study, $1,500 for one night, no prior health conditions required. She had been struggling to pay rent, and the promise of quick cash was irresistible. Besides, she'd always been a heavy sleeper. What could possibly go wrong? The study was being conducted in an old, desolate building on the outskirts of town, a place she didn't even know existed. When she arrived, the facility felt more like an abandoned hospital than a research center. Its facade was faded, windows darkened with grime, and an eerie silence hung in the air. The only sign of life was a man in a white coat who introduced himself as Dr. Elias. His unnervingly calm demeanor and the way his eyes lingered just a little too long made Sarah uneasy, but she brushed it off. She needed the money. Inside, the place was sterile but cold, like the soul of the building had been drained. Dr. Elias led Sarah to a room filled with equipment she couldn't begin to understand. Wires, machines, monitors, all whirring softly like they had a heartbeat of their own. A small, windowless chamber at the back was where she would sleep. The bed was clean but clinical, and a single camera hung in the corner, its red light blinking steadily. "You'll be monitored throughout the night," Dr. Elias explained. "If you experience anything unusual, dreams, sensations, disturbances, don't worry. It's all part of the study." Before she could ask questions, he handed her a clipboard with a long waiver. She barely skimmed it before signing. The quicker this was over, the better. The night started uneventfully. She laid on the bed, the buzz of fluorescent lights from the outer room lulling her into a light sleep. But sometime after midnight, Sarah woke up, or thought she did. The room felt different. The camera light was off, and a faint scratching sound was coming from the walls. At first, she dismissed it as her imagination. But then the scratching grew louder, more erratic, like claws raking against metal. She sat up, heart pounding, and froze when she saw faint movement near the door. A shadow, humanoid but distorted, slipped through the crack and into the room. Its form was wrong, too tall, limbs bending unnaturally, head tilted as if its neck had snapped. "Hello?" Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible over the sound of her own breathing. The figure didn't respond. Instead, it crept closer, the faint glow of the hallway lights casting its grotesque features into partial view. Its face, or what passed for one, was a shifting mass, like static on a broken TV. Panicked, Sarah bolted for the door, only to find it locked. She pounded on it, screaming for help, but no one came. The creature was mere feet away now, its gnarled hand reaching out. Just as its fingers brushed her shoulder, everything went black. She woke up the next morning in the same bed, drenched in sweat. The room was pristine, the camera light blinking red again, and the door was slightly ajar. For a moment, she thought it was all a nightmare, until she noticed deep scratches on the walls and bruises on her arms. Dr. Elias greeted her in the main lab with a smile, acting as though nothing was amiss. When she asked what had happened, he simply said, "You slept soundly through the night, a model participant." Sarah didn't argue. She took her payment and left, vowing never to return. But the story didn't end there. A week later, strange things started happening at home. Objects moved on their own. Lights flickered. Shadows that didn't belong appeared in the corners of her vision. And at night, she'd wake up to that same scratching sound coming from her bedroom walls. Desperate for answers, she tried to contact Dr. Elias, but the research center no longer existed. The building was boarded up, and the phone number was disconnected. It was as if the entire study had never happened. The scratching intensified with each passing night. Then one evening, as she stared into the mirror, she saw it. The creature, standing just behind her, its face still a chaotic mass of shifting static. She didn't even have time to scream before the lights went out. When her landlord finally entered the apartment 2 weeks later, he found the place abandoned. The only clue was a single sheet of paper on the floor. Scrawled across it, in shaky handwriting, were the words, "It follows."
Story number 2.
Late one evening in a quiet rural town, Eric decided to take a shortcut through the woods to get home. The moonlight barely penetrated the thick canopy above, and the air was heavy with the smell of damp earth. Eric had grown up hearing tales about the forest, stories about people who entered and never came out, but he always dismissed them as local folklore meant to scare children. Tonight, though, the woods felt different. The silence wasn't peaceful. It was oppressive, like the forest itself was holding its breath. As he walked, the trail seemed unfamiliar, though he'd taken this route countless times before. The trees looked warped, their gnarled branches twisting into grotesque shapes that clawed at the sky. The deeper he went, the more the air seemed to hum, a low vibration that made the hairs on his neck stand on end. Then he heard it, the soft, rhythmic crunch of leaves behind him. Eric stopped. So did the sound. "Hello?" he called, trying to sound braver than he felt. His voice was swallowed by the darkness. He turned, scanning the woods, but saw nothing. Shrugging it off as an animal, he continued walking, picking up his pace. Crunch, crunch. The sound followed him again, this time closer. He whirled around, but the path behind him was empty. A cold sweat broke out on his forehead. He wasn't alone. Trying to stay calm, Eric pulled out his phone, but there was no signal. The flashlight flickered weakly, as if the device was losing power, despite being fully charged earlier. He decided to jog the rest of the way, desperate to leave the suffocating woods behind. The footsteps quickened. They weren't coming from behind anymore. They were all around him. To his left, a shadow darted between the trees. To his right, another flickered past. They moved too fast to be human, and they were closing in. Eric broke into a full sprint, his breaths coming in ragged gasps. The woods seemed to stretch endlessly, the path twisting and turning in ways he didn't remember. He stumbled, falling hard onto the dirt, and that's when he saw them. Figures emerged from the shadows, their forms barely human. Their faces were pale and featureless like blank canvases. Their limbs were unnaturally long, and they moved with an eerie, jerking rhythm, as if they weren't used to their bodies. They surrounded him, their heads tilting in unison as they studied him. Eric tried to scream, but no sound came out. One of the figures crouched low, its blank face inches from his, and then it spoke, not with words, but with a voice that echoed directly in his mind. "Why are you here?" it asked, the voice layered with countless whispers. "I was just walking home," Eric stammered, trembling. "You should not have come." The figure raised a long, spindly arm and touched his forehead with a finger colder than ice. Pain shot through Eric's skull, a searing, unbearable agony that made him black out. When he woke, it was morning, and he was lying at the edge of the forest. His phone was gone, his clothes were torn, and his skin was covered in deep scratches that weren't there before. The woods behind him were silent, as if they were waiting. Eric staggered home, hoping to put the night behind him, but something wasn't right. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw them, those blank faces, those unnatural movements. Worse, he started hearing the whispers, even when he was awake. They would call his name, always from just out of sight, always growing louder. A week later, Eric vanished without a trace. His neighbors said they heard strange noises coming from his house the night before, sounds like footsteps and whispers. But when they went to check, the house was empty. On his bedroom wall, carved deep into the plaster, were the words, "They are always watching." The woods remain untouched to this day. Locals warn newcomers not to enter, especially after dark. But every now and then, someone ignores the warnings. And every now and then, someone doesn't come back.
Story number 3.
On the outskirts of a small, forgotten town stood an old motel called the Hollow Inn. It was a crumbling relic of the 1950s, with peeling paint, flickering neon signs, and an air of abandonment that made most travelers avoid it. But when Jenny's car broke down on a desolate highway, it was her only option for shelter. The innkeeper, a frail old man with sunken eyes and an unsettling grin, handed her a key to room 6. "Don't mind the noises," he said, almost too casually. Jenny raised an eyebrow but didn't press him. She was exhausted, and the thought of a bed was more appealing than questioning cryptic remarks. The room was worse than she expected, damp, with a faint odor of mildew and furniture that looked like it hadn't been touched in decades. The wallpaper was peeling, and the bed's mattress sagged in the middle. But what unsettled her most was the large mirror bolted to the wall opposite the bed. Its surface was cloudy, as though decades of grime had fused with the glass. As she unpacked, she noticed something strange. When she glanced at the mirror, her reflection seemed delayed, as if it moved a fraction of a second slower than she did. She waved her hand experimentally. The reflection followed, but not perfectly. Its movement was stilted, like an old film reel skipping frames. Uneasy, she avoided looking at it and climbed into bed. The noises started around midnight. At first, it was faint, a soft shuffling sound, like someone walking barefoot on the carpet. Jenny sat up, her heart pounding. The sound seemed to come from the corner of the room near the mirror. She turned on the bedside lamp, flooding the room with dim light. There was nothing there. Old building, she whispered to herself. It's just settling. She laid back down, but the shuffling returned, louder this time. It wasn't random anymore. It circled the bed. Jenny froze, gripping the blanket as her eyes darted to the mirror. Her reflection stared back at her, wide-eyed and trembling, but it wasn't lying down. It was sitting upright. Jenny screamed and bolted out of the bed, knocking over the lamp in her panic. The room plunged into darkness, and the air grew colder, so cold she could see her breath. The shuffling stopped, replaced by a low whisper that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Stay. Stay with us. Jenny fumbled for her phone, desperate for light, but it wouldn't turn on. She grabbed the key and ran to the door, only to find it wouldn't budge. It was locked from the inside. Her reflection in the mirror stood now, motionless, staring at her with an expression that wasn't her own. Its lips curved into a sinister grin. Then it stepped out of the frame. She backed into the corner, hyperventilating as the figure advanced. It moved slowly, deliberately, its footsteps echoing louder than they should in the tiny room. When it was inches away, it leaned in close. Its breath was icy, its face warped and flickering like a distorted video. You shouldn't have come here, it hissed, its voice layered with others, men, women, children, all speaking in unison. Jenny's scream was cut short as the room seemed to collapse around her. The walls folded inward, the air became heavy, and everything went black. The next morning, the innkeeper found room 6 empty. The bed was untouched, and Jenny's belongings were gone, except for her phone, which lay on the dresser with the camera app open. The last photo it captured was of her, standing in the room, her face twisted in terror. But in the mirror behind her, there were dozens of figures, shadowy, faceless, and reaching for her. No one ever stays at the Hollow Inn anymore. The locals say the mirror in room 6 is cursed. If you stare into it long enough, you'll see them. And once you do, they'll see you too.